All right, for the interest of time, I am going to get started while you all settle in, because we have a pretty spectacular opportunity for the next hour and a half. So our session is called Youth in Canada, Envision the Future of Diversity, Belonging, Anti-discrimination, and Anti-oppression. So this session is sponsored by COPA National, and we're going to start off with a short video from them before we move in. So this morning's plenary session with our senior leaders really gave us insight on the origins of the sector and how we arrived at the current state that we're in today. So moving forward, what do we envision for a successful, thriving sector? And most importantly, how do we begin to prepare and work towards that vision? So here to help us construct this roadmap is the diverse and well-founded Council of Youth you see before you, which will look at some of the systems in place and assess their effectiveness. The youth panel will delve into the evolution of Canadian identity and belonging, the dismantling of discrimination and oppression in the hopes of narrowing down on what will be essential to creating a fair and equitable Canada for all. We'll take a few minutes now for each panelist to introduce themselves to you and tell you a little bit about why they're here, and then we're going to jump into the overall discussion. So I'm going to start maybe with you, Holly, okay? And so Holly's going to start off with the introduction.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say, first of all, how honored I am to be here. I'm a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, representing today as a youth Indigenous woman. I currently work for the Public Health Agency of Canada as a junior policy analyst in emergency management. So I got involved through the Indigenous Employee Network, and I reached out to be a part of this opportunity as it just is really dear to my heart and a big passion of mine to speak and be able to share whenever I can, just talking about immigration and Canada as a whole and Indigenous relevant topics. So thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Dana Cortez. I am part of the Canadian Council for Refugees Youth Network core group. I'm very honored to be here as well with a wonderful group of women here. I also really think that providing spaces like this where youth are able to speak about what's on their mind, I think is really important, so I'm very honored to be here.
Hello, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Ruth Altaya, and first and foremost, I want to echo what Holly was saying. Thank you so much for allowing us to be able to have a conversation. As the panel ahead of us said, it is super important to talk about the past and talk about what has happened. So obviously we don't repeat those things, but also so we can learn important lessons. And I think that it's important for us to talk about our futures, and that's why I'm here. I work for a nonprofit organization called Generation Chosen, based in Toronto in the Jane and Finch community. We work with a lot of people who are newcomers, but also with people who we work to interrupt intergenerational trauma, things like violence and violence against our communities. And I think it's super important for us to be able to have a conversation about how youth are impacted, not only by being able to move to a country like Canada, but also, whether they're being accepted or not, or even just how they're being profiled as well. So I'm super excited to be part of this conversation, and thank you for having me.
Hi everyone, my name is Saida Hassan. I am a youth advisory group member from Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. I'm also a student at the University of Toronto, and I'm very, very excited to be here and to share this space with all of you and the lovely people on this panel, just to have these very important conversations.
Bonjour. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Ok, super. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Océane Yao, je suis comme Saïda. Je fais également partie du groupe consultatif des jeunes d'immigration, réfugiés et citoyenneté Canada. Et moi, je suis canadienne d'origine ivoirienne et j'ai travaillé entre 2020 et 2022 avec des jeunes francophones au Manitoba pour les aider à mettre sur pied des projets communautaires. Et je les ai accompagnés dans les écoles, dans la communauté, etc. Et aujourd'hui, je suis étudiante en droit à l'université de Moncton. Voilà, depuis quelques mois maintenant. Donc voilà, merci.
Oh. Hello everyone, my name is Ira Mamis and I currently reside in Whitehorse, Yukon in the traditional territory of the Kwalin First Nations and Ta'an Quechan Council. I'm very excited and honored to be joining this panel alongside the fellow members here. And I am here in partnership with the Canadian Council for Refugees Youth Network and very excited to be part of this next hour with everyone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you all. My name is Salma Ihsan. I am Mexican and Pakistani and an immigrant to Canada. My family came here in 2005. I currently reside in Victoria, BC, and was put forward for this panel by the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. Thanks, Jean. My academic background is in applied linguistics, so I actually trained to be a Link instructor, but I've found myself through COVID, when that sort of took a pause, working in nonprofit in other ways. Currently, I work in Indigenous language revitalization in BC, but I'm very passionate about the immigration and settlement sector, so I'm really excited to be here and be part of this conversation.
Great, thank you, thanks everybody. So we had a chat before and decided we're gonna do this more kind of young people podcast style, which is awesome because that means I get to sit down. And rookie mistake, I wore heels and Jean and Vicky wore running shoes. So I have learned for next time that I will wear running shoes. So I'm really happy that we're doing it this way. And so just for any of you who are referring to our panel, or if you are live tweeting, we all use she, her pronouns. And so we just wanted to make sure that that was something that you all knew going forward. And Océane will be speaking in French. So if you do not have a headset, we do encourage you to have a headset if you would like to, or if you need the support with French or English for the rest of us. So I'm going to pose some questions, and then we'll go over to Slido and see the questions that are coming in there. But the first question is going to focus on Canadian identity. And so I'm going to pose this question, and the first person I'm going to go to is Salma, and then I'm going to bounce it over to Ruth, but everybody's going to jump in, and we're going to do this much more conversationally. So the first question is, do you think Canadian identity will evolve in the future, and what is your vision for what that identity should look like? From your perspective, what can we do to make sure that this identity is more inclusive? So I'm going to start with you, Salma, and then Ruth, you're going to go.
Okay, thanks, Katie. I find this question really interesting because I want to kind of start at the root of what are we talking about when we say Canadian identity. And I think there's a need to acknowledge this assumption that we might have that all immigrants and newcomers or Indigenous people want to be described as or want to fit into what Canadian identity might mean. So yeah, what are we really like talking about when we're trying to make this a more inclusive place to be and trying to make people feel more comfortable and in their own skin? I think the idea of creating a quote unquote Canadian identity that is all encompassing kind of removes the value of having a sense of identity, because identity is rooted in culture and traditions and shared history and experiences in land and in language. And when you're trying to make Canadian identity so inclusive that it tries to do that for every single person who lives in Canada, you're kind of losing the value of what it means to identify with something. So I think we can talk about what it means to be an inclusive Canada and what it means to not make assumptions about people and assume where they came from or what their connection to Canada is. But I don't know if really tackling this idea of Canadian identity is something we can even do.
Yeah, I think that was so beautifully said. And even just to add on that, I think we can't talk about like Canadian identity without talking about like Indigenous people that don't identify as Canadians, and this being their land to begin with, right? Or even when talking about Canadian identity, like, are we talking about the Eurocentric view of what Canadian means, right? If you assimilate to a Eurocentric kind of positioning, or the way that you act or the way that you are like is more Eurocentric, then you're fitting in more with this view of what we think Canadian kind of heritage is. But when you look at Nova Scotia, for example, there are people there, generations upon generations, the Moors that came from Jamaica, and they have further generations down in Canada when the slave ships came and dropped them off and wanted them to freeze to death, but they survived and they were resilient nonetheless. And we've got people like that who have years upon years, generations upon generations of heritage, yet someone will go there and still ask, hey, so where are you from? I'm from Canada. No, but like past that, like where are you actually from? And it's like from Canada and more generations than a lot of people can say, right? So when we're looking at like Canadian, the first step in inclusion is one, including the people whose land this is and who sadly don't call it Canada, right? Like that's not what their name for it is. But then also ensuring that we don't look at Canada as a Eurocentric kind of view of what Canada is. Another thing I want to say is I myself, like my family, migrated to this country as well. I was born in the Netherlands, and it's very interesting that whenever I'm out in countries outside of Canada, I am a Canadian citizen, and I very quickly will say that I'm from Canada. And I'm very proud to say so too, right? Like when I went to Mexico, hey, where are you from? Show my Canadian passport. I'm like, oh, I'm from Canada, right? And I'm so proud to say it, versus when I come back to the country that I reside in, the country that I serve in, the country that I work in, and that I'm a part of. People ask me where I'm from, and I'm a little bit more shy to say that I'm Canadian, because the question of, okay, but like, where were you born? And like, where do you actually come from comes up, right? And for me, I personally like love to say that I'm Canadian. That's something that it's like on the forefront. I'm just like, yeah, like I'm Canadian. Because when I grew up in the Netherlands, I was told that I wasn't Dutch because of the way that I look, right? In those countries where people look more like one another, where if you don't have blue eyes and blonde hair and white skin, you're not considered Dutch. Or when I was in the States, like I wasn't considered American. I came to Canada, and that was something where people said, no, you're Canadian. You are part of us. Like, we are a mosaic of people, and you being culturally different is amazing and fun, and it's part of us. Although I know that we were talking, Dana and I, earlier, that's not necessarily the experience of all people that migrate here. So Dana, if you want to chat on that point as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm glad you touched on the Eurocentric part of, when we talk about Canadian identity. So in my personal experience, Ruth mentioned, when she leaves Canada and she's in another country, she's able to say, I'm Canadian. In my experience, I don't feel Canadian because of the experiences that I had growing up. I have a Canadian citizenship, and I am Canadian, right? But sometimes I feel like I'm not Canadian enough because I don't fit into that Eurocentric stereotype, I guess, or the Eurocentric identity of Canadian identity. So we were saying, how interesting it is that it's so different, the way she feels as a newcomer in Canada versus how I feel in Canada. And it's hard sometimes explaining how I feel, because I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I have in this country. I'm so grateful for being in this country, but at the same time, growing up, there have been times where I have been, left out. Like yes, I have a Canadian citizenship, but my traditions are different. I speak a different language, so that has kind of set me apart a lot of times, and that's where I struggle with, well, I'm Canadian, but I'm not really Canadian like other Canadians, right? So I think it's important to talk about how different newcomer experiences are. We need to be careful with, generalizing all newcomers and thinking, oh, because you're a newcomer, your experiences are going to be the same, because they're not. Even if we're from the same country, we may be newcomers from the same country, but our experiences are going to be so different and so unique, and it's important to recognize that, because that means that we're going to have different needs and different supports because our experiences are so different.
If I can, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if I can jump in there, I think when we were looking at the idea of Canadian, there's also the question of, are we talking about Canadian citizens? Are we talking about people with PR cards? Are we talking about refugees? Where are we drawing the line of what is Canadian, and what traits and categories do you need to have to be considered Canadian? And then if we delve into that, there's also the question of, like, should identity be framed in such a way that it's a checklist of things that you need to cross off, or is it really an amalgamation of all the places you've been, the countries you've lived in, the people you've met? There's a question of how are we defining our identity, and the issue with trying to define or create a set of categories is that it, by its nature, becomes restrictive and it becomes constricting, because the moment you try to add like a checklist of things, you're taking something that could be inclusive and you're starting to put constraints and rules and things like that, and that really takes away from the potential for it to be inclusive and to include anyone that can fit into or can feel like they belong. And identity also links a lot to the concept of belonging. You're not going to claim an identity to which you don't feel that you belong. So there's also questions of, how do you decide that you belong? What experiences make you feel that you do belong or that you don't belong? And there's a lot to consider there as well.
Yes, to your point, Sadie, you said it perfectly. It kind of segues into our next question, but that question of belonging and only wanting to identify with what you feel you belong to. And I feel that I can confidently say that most Indigenous people do not and will not identify as Canadian, because they're not proud. We are not proud as a community to be from a country that has caused so much harm to us, and it's still very present, and it continues. I think we're on the right track with all of the calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has laid out. But that it's just that, it's a great start. We have so much more work to do. And I hope, as an Indigenous youth, and also part Canadian, as my father's Indigenous, my mother is Canadian, I hope that one day Canadian identity is simply just, I feel that it should define someone that is just kind and accepting and just genuine and kind to your fellow human being. That's what I hope.
So exploring this concept of belonging, right? So we're trying to identify identity, and realizing that we're probably not going to do that, right? And so how do we then wrestle with this concept of belonging, and what can we do to enhance people's feelings of belonging in this context of struggling even to figure out how we identify as Canadians? So Ira, I'm gonna pass this one over to you.
Yeah, belonging it's such a big topic, and I'm really happy to hear some of the conversations that are coming out already. And just to backtrack a little bit about Dana's comments, the organization that her and I both are involved in touch a lot about identity. And something that she had mentioned when she was talking was this whole idea of being born elsewhere and then coming here, and what we would term as maybe like a 1.5 generation, which I identify as being born in the Philippines and having moved out of all places in Canada to the Yukon. And what that really looks like, and also hearing a lot of these topics about what it's like not having access to a lot of the same services and resources and opportunities that other immigrants and newcomers and refugees may have coming from different countries as well. So what does that look like? It adds to another layer of what belonging really looks like when you decide to migrate into a place where the immigrant community is very small. And so I think for me, just to touch on Katie's question about what would it take to enhance feelings of belonging, I think it's, at the end of the day, really just being able to celebrate people's cultures and people's diversity in their uniqueness. I think, as we've heard a few times, like, no one's immigrant experience is ever the same. There's little nuances and little things here and there. And also just taking the time to educate yourself and learn and be curious and ask questions, because there's so much that we don't know. And I think just always coming in from that perspective as well. And I think for myself, I will be the last person on the list to ask. I will always ask whatever question, even though it may seem like a silly thing, because I'm genuinely curious, and I think that's very important in order to be able to celebrate fully everyone's uniqueness and to be able to increase that sense of belonging. Thank you.
I think Ira has really touched on a lot of beautiful points about, on an individual level, what can we do to make sure we're enhancing feelings of belonging. But I think it's also just as important to acknowledge the systemic changes that need to happen to enhance feelings of belonging, as much as everyone in this room can work to be kind and caring and compassionate. If there are still systems in place that are, disproportionately negatively affecting minorities and racialized people, then people are not going to feel like they belong, even if you're kind to them to their face, because it feels ingenuine. It feels like a facade, because you're being really kind to them and trying to be compassionate and empathetic. But then, you have these insanely high percentages of racialized people and indigenous people in the prison system. So the police and prison system are still working against people that look like us. So how can you feel like you really do belong in this country when you still feel like you're being targeted or like you're being watched? So I think, I really love that point about what you can do on an individual level, but I think we really do need to look at systemic level changes as well in education, in policing, in politics, at every level.
So we're going to go to Océane, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ruth.
Oui, comment je pense à l'inclusion, juste pour revenir. Oh, ok, je vous donne du temps. Ok, donc juste pour revenir un peu sur ce que vous avez mentionné sur le plan individuel, donc au niveau micro-sociologique. Parfois, quand on pense à l'inclusion, on peut souvent penser à des ateliers, à des programmes qu'on pourrait mettre sur pied dans les communautés. On peut penser à des projets on peut penser à des micro-subventions, de milliers de dollars, de millions de dollars, afin de mettre sur pied un projet. Alors que ça peut se faire, comme tu l'as mentionné, en faisant des efforts personnels. Par exemple, j'ai travaillé avec une jeune qui avait demandé une bourse de juste $250 pour organiser un projet simple et qui portait sur, en bon franglais, on dit un potluck culturel. Et donc ce projet-là a permis de rassembler une vingtaine de personnes chez elle qui venaient d'ailleurs, et afin de valoriser la culture de tout et chacun. Et donc parfois on pense qu'on a besoin de s'outiller, comme je l'ai mentionné tout à l'heure, de milliers de dollars pour faire quelque chose, mais non, pas forcément. On peut se poser la question personnellement, mais qu'est-ce que j'ai ? Même si ce sont juste des questions, quelles questions est-ce que je peux poser, comment est-ce que je peux aider la personne qui vient d'arriver pour qu'elle se sente à l'aise, incluse dans la communauté. Donc je pense que ça revient à ce niveau-là. Qu'est-ce que je peux faire? Qu'est-ce que j'ai? Et comment est-ce que je peux utiliser ce que j'ai pour aider la personne qui est en face de moi?
I think that, again, the points that you all are making are beautiful. I think a huge part of it is also making a distinction between cultural appreciation and appropriation, and usurping a culture and trying to make it your own versus actually actively wanting to learn more about it, right? And wanting to kind of engage with it and learn the history of that culture as well. We are not having people come to Canada so that we can take their culture and say, look at how diverse Canada is, right? Or like, look at our mosaic of things. Like I was missing this piece that, you know, like I was missing this piece of someone from Ethiopia, but now I've brought somebody over from Ethiopia, and look, now we have an Ethiopia, like a little Ethiopia, a little Portugal, a little Jamaica. Like we've got all of these things that are so diverse, but then it turns into like being token people and tokenization as well. And that's super harmful because we're human beings, right? Like it's not an exhibit or something that you get to like watch and see. And I think I was talking to the girls about this earlier as well, where we were talking about the difference between wanting to know where someone is from and like kind of just being like, oh, like I know that about that person, and asking a person who they are. Right? There isn't sense in inviting people to come to Canada. There isn't sense in having doors wide open if we ourselves are not trying to make Canada a better place for people who are migrating here. There's a saying that I absolutely love. It's one thing to invite someone to a party. It's another to invite them to dance, right? There's no sense of inviting someone to a party if they're going to sit in a corner and not get to experience and see what it's like to be part of Canada. Right? Like there's so many beautiful and amazing things that we have here in Canada, but if people are locked off from that because they look a way that, you know, is overrepresented in prison systems, or they look a way that might be suspicious to some, or, you know, people have harmful views of them, then we're never going to get to a point where people feel safe here in Canada.
Oui, moi je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toi sur... Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toi, surtout la citation que tu as partagée. Tu as dit, c'est une chose d'inviter quelqu'un à une fête et c'en est une autre de l'inviter à danser. Et ça permet, je pense que ça permet aussi de souligner la différence entre plus ou moins la diversité et l'inclusion. Il ne faut pas faire l'amalgame entre les deux termes, c'est pas la même chose. Et puis, il ne s'agit pas d'une case à cocher, c'est pas, oh, on prend de belles photos pour notre entreprise et puis voilà. Non. Quand il y a la diversité, il y a l'inclusion, il ne faut pas que l'on s'attende à ce que tout soit parfait, etc. Non, au contraire, l'inclusion et la diversité permettent de rassembler des personnes qui conçoivent le monde de façon différente. Alors, il faut qu'on soit à l'aise au fait que, vous voyez, on va faire face à des désaccords. Voilà, et ce sera difficile. Il faut qu'on soit conscient de cela et qu'on soit prêt à affronter cette réalité-là qui se présentera à nous lorsque nous serons dans un milieu où il y a réellement une diversité et où il y a réellement de l'inclusion. Merci.
Okay, does anyone else want to wait? Yes, Ada, go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. So when we think of, this actually came up with what you were talking about, and the whole issue with checklist diversity, or thinking of achieving diversity as something as like, I need someone from here, I need someone from here, like you were talking about. The issue with that, along other issues, is that it gives a sense of completion once you've made the checklist. You can tell yourself, I've achieved diversity, I've done it, like I'm done. And that's a problem, because diversity, it shouldn't be thought of as an end goal. It should be a continuous goal. It should be a continuous process of, I need to keep achieving diversity. It's not a question of, have I achieved it? It's, okay, I've done this. What else can I do? What's the next step? Because it's sort of similar to the concept of justice. What's justice for one person isn't for someone else. So it's a process of, it needs to keep going, and it needs to be thought of as a continuous journey rather than a destination that we're trying to reach so we can move on to the next thing or the next pressing issue. It's about acknowledging that it's continuous. It needs to keep going.
Katie, I just want to add one more thing. Just like, you know, looking in this room, all the people that work in this sector, like speaking on Saida's point, I think, you know, we run into restrictions when we are working in settlement services about the kinds of people we can serve. And so I think a lot about when we have a restriction for after someone has become a Canadian citizen, they are no longer someone that we can serve, or at least not as fully anymore. And their journey has not ended. They have not become a Canadian citizen, and now all of their problems that they had while they were trying to become settled here have gone away. They're still going to be like dealing with all of those issues. So like on a personal point and an individual point, like that tracks, but also within the system of settlement and within the sector, we also need to think about advocating for those people to have continued support after they've become citizens.
Okay, so I think that actually is a really good segue into our next question, because our next question is not necessarily looking at newcomers who are accessing settlement services, but we're looking at this on a broad scale, looking at anti-discrimination and anti-oppression. And we have this worded as activities, but I think we could say activities, we could say frameworks, we could say systems, we could say initiatives. Do you think current, insert any one of those words here, are useful and effective? And then if not, what can we do to make them more effective? And so I'm going to land this question on Dana, and then we'll open it up to the group to discuss.
Thank you. Yeah, so when it comes to anti-discrimination activities, one of the things that comes to mind is that sometimes when these activities are being done, it feels like it's not genuine. It's just being done because it looks good, not because we actually care about the people. So one of the things that came to mind was land acknowledgements, how sometimes, land acknowledgements are so important, but sometimes it feels like they're only being done because that's what's expected, right? Because, and once they're done, it's like, okay, well, I did my part, now let me move on. But are we actually taking a minute to think about what a land acknowledgement means? What are we acknowledging, and the importance of it? And I did want to pass it on to Holly. I think she can give off. Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Dana. That is a really, really great point to touch on, because I feel like from what I've experienced, most land acknowledgements, they don't feel genuine, or they don't feel genuinely received by the people hearing them. And, I think it's useful as pieces of knowledge to those who are listening to it. The genuine part is, I think, the most important. And in terms of maybe what we can do to find ways that are more genuine to acknowledge the people around us and like the original people of the land, I think it just stems from educational activities and just providing the honest, raw truth, and getting into the beauty that is Indigenous culture, and just sharing that with people and allowing them to have that knowledge and almost expertise into what Indigenous culture really is. I think that will allow people to open up their hearts and souls and minds to some of the original people of this land. And I think that might be the best way to kind of tackle getting genuine, caring responses from people.
I think really, Holly, what you've kind of touched on is like the need for more education. And we can think about that like in school systems for kids growing up to like have the full context of what it, took to get Canada to where it is today. But I think also you brought in the TRC calls to action. The last 3 TRC calls to action are all about immigration and immigration services and settlement services. And it's about education for immigrants when they're coming to this country to understand, like, you are coming to this country, and if you might be coming from a country where there's turmoil, where it's unsafe, where you are like fleeing, where you are trying to protect your safety, and it is important that you have a safe place to land. But you also need to consider, if you're coming here for economic growth, for opportunities and things like that, the reason there is an opportunity for economic growth in Canada is because it was taken away from Indigenous people. So I think in general, there's more education needed, both for immigrants and refugees, people who are coming to Canada and settling here, as well as the people who live here and grew up here and have generations of people here who are in the school system, because you're not just gonna, graduate high school or university and immediately become anti-racist and you're going to work against like oppression. You need to kind of be like raised and like learn those, you need to have those tools in your back pocket as you're growing up to be able to actually implement them and act on them when you're an adult. So I think education on all sides really needs to happen.
Okay, so this also kind of brings up the idea of people in systems or in organizations devoted to addressing racism or prejudice or issues like that. They also need to be conscious themselves of their own roles in perpetuating the issues they're trying to dismantle, because it's very easy to say that our XYZ organization is focused at addressing the lack of diversity. But it's easy to say that, but it requires the organization themselves to look back at themselves and say, I've been criticizing how it works elsewhere. Let me look inside and see, is my organization meeting the requirements that I'm asking other people to meet? Am I taking every initiative and every step to ensure that I'm not perpetuating the problems I'm trying to take apart? And it's a difficult thing to do, but the importance of tackling difficult questions or uncomfortable questions is that if they're done well, if they're addressed well and tackled well, they result in better situations in the future where those questions no longer feel uncomfortable. They're just part of the discussion. It's about creating an environment for the future as opposed to just that moment where a question that we might feel is uncomfortable later becomes part of the norm. Like, yes, we need to ask this question, we need to ask this question. And it's about kind of opening up the spaces and recognizing that while we're trying to help, that while we're trying to make positive changes, we ourselves are equally liable to make the mistakes that we're trying to fix in others.
So just to go off what Saida was saying, how she's talking about, like organizations need to reflect as well. I think it's important to note that discomfort can be a good thing sometimes. It's okay to feel discomfort. Maybe, it means that some progress is being made. And I think also it's really easy sometimes when we feel uncomfortable to kind of shy away and ignore certain topics. But I think it's better if we sit with that discomfort and reflect, like, why do I feel uncomfortable right now? What about this topic is triggering that feeling of discomfort? And being transparent about it, opening up about it. Well, this is kind of, this is why I feel uncomfortable. I think that it's really important for us to be 100% honest with each other, because that's the only way that we'll be able to understand and then move forward with that. So I think discomfort can be a good thing, and we need to sit back and reflect on that.
As you guys are all talking, I began to think about, so Generation Chosen, we also do capacity building kind of facilitations and seminars. So one of my favorite things to do is go into corporate spaces and talk about diversity and inclusion, because as everybody knows, DEI is like this huge buzzword now everywhere you go. It's like all over LinkedIn. But having a conversation in a room full of people, and oftentimes people that don't look like me, can be very stressful and very anxiety inducing. And especially when the slide comes on about like white fragility and it's just a room full of white people and you're the only person of color, it's like, okay, this is going to happen right now. But even that feeling, right? Like, I'm a youth, right? I'm a person of color. I migrated to this country. I'm speaking to a bunch of people who have been in this industry for a very long time. And this is one of the few times where youth get to speak up and have the moment to really say, hey, this is our future that we're talking about here. This is the future of our Canada, right? All of our Canada, but like our Canada to be, right? And I think it's super important to note that pieces like white fragility or ageism or discrimination, sexism, all of these things have a huge part to play in it, because it's so like woven within our culture. And I think that the only way to make anything inclusive is to actively be anti whatever is making it not inclusive, right? What's making it exclusive, what's saying that, hey, you're not allowed to be in this space or you're not allowed to speak in this space. And even if it's not like overt, right, it's still happening in the microaggression. So I think the only way to truly get rid of things that are discriminatory is to be anti-discriminatory and to actively do those things. It's not enough to just sit back and say, well, Canada is inclusive and at least we're not like the States, right? Because guess what? There's problems on both ends. I lived in Texas, I lived here too, and I can definitely tell you that it exists in both countries. So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, you guys are amazing. Okay, next question. So this is the last of the scripted questions that I have, and then we'll pause and watch our sponsor video. Then we'll go into a Q&A. There we go. Okay, so expert panel of youth, do you envision a future Canada in which discrimination and oppression are exceptions rather than everyday occurrences? And if so, how can we get there? So I'm landing this question on you, OCN. Headsets on, everybody.
We have 3 seconds, guys. Oh Ok, donc, c'est une question qui demande beaucoup de réflexion. On ne peut pas juste dire, bien sûr, on veut rester optimiste. J'ai une collègue qui m'a dit une fois que, ok, si nous, on n'a pas de l'espoir, qui aura l'espoir pour nous? Mais il faudrait quand même qu'on puisse observer la réalité également. Comme je pense que vous l'avez déjà mentionné, nous avons besoin d'être honnêtes avec là où on se trouve afin de pouvoir avancer dans la bonne direction, vous voyez. Mais comme Holly l'a mentionné tout à l'heure en répondant à la question précédente, c'est vraiment le savoir qui pourra nous aider. Et d'ailleurs, si je ne me trompe pas, dans le préambule du Code du droit de la personne du Manitoba, il est mentionné que, bon, je vais paraphraser, je ne vais pas faire une dictée, mais il est inscrit que la discrimination est souvent enracinée dans l'ignorance et que seul le savoir permettra d'éradiquer la discrimination. Vous voyez, et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec cela parce que c'est une question très difficile, guys. C'est vrai. C'est vrai. Pourquoi est-ce que je le dis? C'est que même dans une entreprise, par exemple, on offre la meilleure formation. En communauté, on offre les meilleures formations. On fait de notre mieux. On fait notre part, vous voyez. Mais il revient quand même à la personne, à l'individu, d'effectuer un choix personnel. Et comme tu l'as mentionné tout à l'heure, il faut qu'on soit prêt à faire appel à l'introspection. Tout et chacun doit avoir la volonté personnelle. Et ce qui me fend le cœur, c'est qu'on ne peut pas forcer quelqu'un à avoir la volonté. On peut faire notre part. Mais comment faire pour secouer la personne comme « Hey, voici la réalité ». On regarde George Floyd, on regarde Joyce, on regarde les tombes non marquées qui ont été retrouvées. On regarde toutes ces choses-là, mais on dit, mais réveillez-vous. Réveillons-nous, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Vous voyez? Et c'est vraiment un travail de longue haleine qui demande beaucoup de persévérance, beaucoup de patience. La constance également. La constance, pourquoi? Ce que j'ai remarqué, c'est que on attend qu'il y ait un événement afin de commencer à se mobiliser pour dire, OK, on va mettre sur pied tel programme, on va commencer à organiser des tables rondes, etc. Et puis après, c'est comme si on passait à autre chose, Mais non, avec ou sans événement catastrophique, il faut qu'on demeure dans la constance, parce que c'est dans la constance qu'on trouve, qu'on arrive à avoir de réels résultats. Et ça, c'est à tous les niveaux. On peut parler de l'antidiscrimination, mais même sur le plan personnel, je sais pas, même quand quelqu'un veut commencer à faire du sport, tu vas pas faire le sport une fois par an et puis espérer d'obtenir des résultats, vous voyez. C'est vraiment la constance en toutes choses et même sur le plan de l'antiracisme, l'antidiscrimination. Donc c'est ça. C'est ça pour moi.
Another thing, I won't say it as eloquently as Ocean did, but what I really want to point out is also the systems that we're operating within. And my background, or what I'm studying, is criminology, so I'm coming at this from a very criminal justice-oriented approach. And the immediate question I have is, like someone was talking about earlier, the overrepresentation of Indigenous and marginalized populations in prison systems. So to give you a little stat, there was a study done, I think, in 2017 or 2019, where they found that the Indigenous population makes up about 3.8 of the national Canadian population, but in prison systems, they are 64.1% of the federal incarceration system. That is a stat that is mind-blowing if you even think about it for less than a second. It's insane. So how, and the other issue is that because it's the justice system, there's a particularly painful irony in it being a system that is meant to be fair, meant to be equitable, meant to indicate when you have a problem or a dispute, you turn to the legal systems to support you. But if those systems are imprisoning you without any reason, without any real claim or any credibility, and I think the instinct might be to say, no, the justice system does a very good job. It's very precise. It's not. It's easy to think that way, but it's not. Like, for example, in 2003, there was, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but this was called Project Thread. And it was an RCMP investigation done on 23 or 24 immigrant newcomer students who were studying in the GTA. Without any real evidence, they were imprisoned and detained for about 5 months and told that if they wanted to be released from detainment, they needed to agree to be deported out of the country, otherwise they would remain in detainment. And then later on, when the investigation was kind of closed up, the RCMP admitted that the evidence was circumstantial and flimsy, but it was enough under the terrorism laws to impose those kind of restrictions. So if you have restrictions like that, how can you expect for there to be a future where discrimination isn't the norm if it's so deeply entrenched in the systems that create the norms? So I like to think of myself as a pessimistic optimist. I want to be optimistic, but I also want to be realistic. And hope is integral, hope is necessary, hope is vital. But it's not enough to say, I know there's a problem. You have to get involved and you have to actually address the problem. And frankly, from a criminological perspective, the immediate instinct is to say we need to do something about our prison systems, our justice system, and address all of the embedded intricacies of inequality, and even accessing lawyers. If you want to access a very good lawyer, that's going to cost you a pretty penny. And if you're coming from a marginalized or a background where you don't have access to as many funds, it's not going to be, it's a very different place, and everyone comes to the idea of justice from very different positions. And if we want a Canada where where discrimination is the exception, we need to dismantle the systems that have made it like a regularity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Beautifully well said, Seda. And just kind of revisiting how pivotal education, just honest education, allowing people to know the truth and decide where they want to go with it. I think additionally to that, when we're looking at everybody, Indigenous people included, and for my purposes of conversation, my focal point, I think secondly, but also incredibly important, is addressing like mental health and the traumas that have been faced generationally for Indigenous people. But I think that's also kind of what links us together, immigrants and Indigenous people, is all the trauma that we have likely faced. And with Seda talking about the increased number of Indigenous people incarceration right now, it just, at face value, it's like, oh, these people are bad, these people are criminals. Like you get a bad rap, but really we forget to look at each other as human beings. And like, everybody needs help. They're not there because they're bad people. They're there because they've been hurt in some way and no one has listened to them and no one has helped them, and there are not systems in place to help people. I was privileged enough to have all the right mixtures in my environment help me to ultimately, like I grew up on a reserve, so ultimately help me get off the reserve. Growing up, that's the goal of most youth, is to make it off, and a lot of people don't. And a lot of people don't even make it off alive. And it's very real to this day. And so just for me to make it off and make it through secondary school and make it to secondary school. I graduated from the University of Guelph, and it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And then, like, right away, I was reached out to by the federal government, Public Health Agency of Canada, with an opportunity because I put myself in an Indigenous student pool. So it worked really, really well for me, but there are so many other Indigenous youth that are fighting to reach these opportunities that are ultimately unreachable, you know, and they could be the most amazing people in the world and try their hearts out to get there. But at the end of the day, I think the limiting factor for Indigenous people, but also just everyone in general, is just this investing in mental health and mental wellness and healing intergenerational trauma, but also maybe trauma that isn't intergenerational. Right? And we all need equal opportunity to become mentally well and just balanced as individuals so that we can go out and be beautiful people to others and help people like find the beauty in themselves. And it sounds cheesy, but to love each other, but that's what we need. And after, you know, COVID-19, the pandemic, I think we all have a very uniquely shared experience of trauma. And it's kind of bonded us in a more beautiful way. So I think we have a really unique opportunity in front of us coming out of the pandemic to maybe start those conversations of vulnerability and maybe just go from there and try to connect with people through your hearts, and the rest I think will follow.
Oh, sorry, Ruth. I just want to thank you, Holly, for being so vulnerable with that question as well. But I think really one of the main things I take from that is talking about people's needs being met across the board. That goes for, you know, Canadians, Canadian-born Canadians as well, not just naturalized citizens, but everyone needs to have their needs met, and the odds are often against marginalized and racialized communities. We need to have access to housing, we need to have food security, we need to have access, and it needs to be accessible to get education, and those things are often, you know, not in our favor. And it's a vicious cycle, right? You end up with people who you had all the odds in your favor, and that's beautiful, and there are so many people that look like us that aren't here because the odds were against them, and because they didn't have support, they didn't have you know, financial security, they didn't have food security, they didn't have security in their housing, and it contributes to, you know, when you can't afford to go to post-secondary, you don't get a higher education, you can't get a better job, now you're like on the poverty line. That leads to, you know, a higher increase of potentially becoming houseless, of potentially having mental health issues, of potentially getting incarcerated, and there's not enough of those needs being met across the board to try to prevent that from continuing to happen. So I think I hope someone will go after me because I don't want to leave this question on a downer, but the first time I read this question, I thought to myself, no, I don't know if it's possible for Canada to get to a place where it is an exception to be discriminated against, because there are systems in place that are against us.
Yeah, for sure. So as you were both speaking, and Holly, you were saying something about like the chances, the odds of you being able to do something. It should never be left like a toss of a dice. Like it should never be left to probability or chance or any of that, right? Like we should try to ensure that these are like permanent changes that'll ensure safety, that'll ensure help. And I wanted to chat a little. So I am based within the Jane and Finch community. And for those of you who were here in 2005, there's something called the Summer of the Gun. And there was a huge initiative that the federal government and the provincial government also funded called TAVIS, where they took police officers and they planted them within marginalized communities and racialized communities to ensure safety, public safety. And what ended up taking place was my family migrated to Canada near this time, and we lived in a neighborhood that had TAVIS police officers patrolling the schools, checking the community centers, checking all of the areas where kids could just be kids and be social. There have been multiple reports now after TAVIS was removed, where it came out that police officers were beating up children because they seemed suspicious. Vicious carding was a thing that only became illegal a little bit ago. And TAVIS stayed from 2005 until 2017. It outlasted multiple prime ministers from different parties. And this is something that I really wanted to push on, that racism, that discrimination does not have a party. Right? It is non-partisan. Hate is non-partisan. Anybody is capable of it, because the systems that we use to vote for people to come into these positions of power, right, itself is broken. The reason I bring this up is because I want to say something on a more personal end. So last night, a couple of us went and we had dinner, and there were a couple of police officers outside because there was a situation that took place. And after having a great time, we're taking photos and having a moment. And as I walked outside of the restaurant that was downstairs here in the hotel, I saw the police officers and I made eye contact with them. And my heart almost leaped out of my chest, and I felt super nervous and super anxious. And my question to myself was, well, I shouldn't feel anxious. I shouldn't feel nervous. Why am I feeling this way? Because I'm a speaker at this event. I'm a panelist. Like, more than anyone, I'm supposed to be in this place, so they're not going to come up to me and say anything to me. And the rationale started, pumping in my head. I'm just like, be rational, right? But my feelings and my trauma and my past of being asked to give my ID and being carded when I was younger during TAVIS told me that this is not a safe space anymore. It is not a safe place. And this is the experience of only one person. Imagine the people who are still living within these marginalized and racialized communities where police officers have deemed these places as unsafe. Jane and Finch is one of the most one of the places with the most immigrants, right, that migrate to the country, one of the most immigrants, yet it is one of the most heavily policed neighborhoods, and is one of the most, just the injustice that takes place with police officers there as we serve there is ridiculous. You've got mothers introducing their sons to police officers so that they recognize, hey, when you see this one, it's not anybody that is involved within gun violence or drugs, right? These are issues that are happening in Canada right now, and unless we shift and change those things and these realities, we can't say that we have hope for the future. Again, I'm a hopeful pessimist, or what was it that you said, the thing, an optimistic pessimist as well, where I want to be optimistic, but again, I think that we need to see the gravity of what we're fighting against first before we begin to talk about the optimism. Let's look at why people are skeptical first, and then talk about the optimism.
Whew. All right. We're going to take a break and watch a video from our sponsor. So honestly, we are going to take a break just for a moment, and because we're going to jump into our Q&A session. And so I'm going to just pause, and we're going to watch the video from COPA National, who generously sponsored this conversation, and then we're going to get right back into it. Great, thank you. That was very catchy music. I like that. All right, so we're just going to wait for the Slido questions to come back up on the screen. We'll get everybody to take a nice, great, big, deep breath, and we're going to dive in to some of these questions. There was a couple in there that I was seeing that I was getting excited about, so I'm looking forward to seeing the questions when they come back up. And there they go. Okay, so I will read the question, and then I will wait for you to clamber over top of each other to answer it first. So the first question, and I'm wondering if actually the first one we should kick over to you, Selma, because you are in the settlement sector, and it is quite specific to the settlement sector, but it is also settlement and immigration work. So I don't think we have to say this is just the sector. I think we can acknowledge that this is work. But I will start with you, Selma, then. Where and how do you think the youth voice can be better included in immigration and settlement work?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think this is a really fantastic place to be to talk about that question, because we are putting a spotlight on youth at a conference where a lot of people are in the sector. And so you're able to hear us out and hopefully take what you've heard from us and put it back into the work that you're doing in communities. So I think, first and foremost, just give youth the opportunity to speak on their lived experiences, on what it's like to be an immigrant in this country, a second-generation immigrant, a naturalized citizen or Canadian born, but a person of color that has a history somewhere else. What is it like to have that experience, and what kind of support do you need that I can, try to implement for you? Yeah, I definitely think that giving youth the opportunity to speak is huge. I think also catering, providing programming for immigrant youth and making sure that there are specific kind of frameworks in place so that youth that, don't feel like they fit in fully with the culture or country that they came from, but don't fully fit in with what it means to be Canadian, where is their space? And do they have a safe space to even just talk and kind of relate to other people like them, giving them the opportunity to have those spaces. Absolutely, yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Yeah.
So one of the other places that I think youth need to be more involved in the immigration settlement sectors, particularly within schools, and I'm specifically referring to high schools. I used to volunteer at this program called the Newcomer Orientation Week. It was hosted by Settlement Education Partnership Toronto, and they would just hold these week-long kind of integration programs for newcomers entering Canadian school systems. So I worked within the high school lens, and one of the things that I noticed most is how little trauma is acknowledged, particularly for people fleeing from post or currently undergoing conflict countries and coming to Canada. The incident that sticks out to me the most, and something that it's years have passed and I still remember it, is that we had a celebration at the end of the orientation week, and we were doing popping balloons, and we were taking everything down, and one of the participants was sitting next to me, and a balloon popped, and he just kind of looked over and laughed and said, I almost thought that was a gunshot. And that's an experience that I would never share, and I know a lot of people wouldn't share that experience, but I felt awful because I was we haven't considered what trauma looks like when it's not obvious, when trauma is small incidents, small little triggers that exist in lived realities that won't be acknowledged or won't be seen until they are explicitly stated by people having lived those realities. So if I think about where youth voices can be better included, it's anything related to trauma, because trauma is best or most deeply understood by people undergoing it, and it's their perspectives, their opinions, their insights that are required. And I look at that particularly for youth and how, frankly speaking, high school can be troubling and intimidating for anybody, but if you're factoring in trauma or factoring in feelings of being excluded or not belonging, it just heightens that kind of trepidation that you're going to feel. So I think that's somewhere that youth would be very welcome and are very much necessary.
Hello. I am going to look at this question based on my experiences growing up in the North, in a smaller community where there isn't there's one immigration agency or organization, but I came to Canada at an age where I was very young and there was nothing really presented to me. It was so much so that they looked at me when I was being enrolled in school and they said, well, English as a second language isn't really a thing around here, so let's teach this one English and French. French didn't stick through, unfortunately, but yeah, it just goes to show that this is during my lifetime. This was only like a decade ago. So I lost my train of thought there, but basically I'm trying to say that growing up in the Yukon, there was really nothing. It just adds another layer of isolation is essentially what it is, where I really spent a lot of my growing up years and my teenage years really being unsure of what my identity was. I often coined it as being torn between two cultures. There was parts to me where I really had to up the Canadianness or whiteness, whatever that may mean. And there's parts to me that I really had to turn up the Filipino-ness just to fit into a certain crowd and stuff. And so it took a few years for me to get to the point where I had to turn my personal lived experiences, because I couldn't just accept the fact that there was really nothing there. And it took me being able to sit with my lived experiences, understand, really take a deep dive into why I am the way I am and my thought processes and my worldviews and my perspectives. And I chose not to continue on that cycle of just accepting that there was nothing there. And so what I ended up having to do was to connect with other organizations and agencies from across Canada, which is really what brought me up here and has led me to a lot of my involvements with other organizations. But I don't think that's a typical trajectory for some people. I think a lot of young people, young immigrants, young newcomers would just say, okay, this is just the way that it is. So what I have chosen to do was just getting involved with my community, speaking to the right people and speaking up and saying there has to be something that has to change. So what it took was going to the organization and saying, hey, I think we need to do something about immigrant youth, newcomer youth, how to make them feel more accepted and belonged, and how do we tap into some of those challenges, the realities, the lived experiences that they're facing. Because more and more, I saw a question on the slide a little bit earlier that there is an increased rates of immigration outside of the Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary areas. And more immigrants are looking into settling in the small communities. And how can we make sure that there are things in place there so that when immigrants and refugees and newcomers move into these other areas of Canada, how can we make sure that there's things established so that they are making sure that they are settling into a place that has the resources needed for them to strive and thrive in their communities?
Okay, so this next question, I am really excited to hear some of your perspectives on this. We talked about this in our conference gathering sessions. So I will put the question out there and then again let you decide who's going to start. But how do you think the whiteness of the majority of senior leaders in this sector, myself included, is affecting diverse youth today and the important work being done?
I mean, I'll just start by saying it takes a toll on anyone to feel like they are not represented somewhere. So, you know, I'll call us out today. We are following the senior leaders panel earlier this morning, and I don't know, do you notice a difference between who is sitting on this panel and who is sitting on that panel? So if we don't... So if we're looking at the senior leaders in this sector and I'm like, I don't really see myself here, like, am I not going to make it further? Is this as far as I go? I will be a youth and I'll be seen for that, and then I won't be able to progress any further than that. So I think there is something to say about not feeling represented and making sure that there is space for people to see themselves in the work that they want to do, because we are the ones who have the lived experience and that can hopefully speak to that when we're doing this work. So definitely I think there is absolutely an effect in who is doing the work and leading these organizations. And I think it's really important that we are like consulting and making sure we're lifting up voices that are often not being heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I think also it can be a little bit intimidating too, right? Because you're not seeing somebody that looks like you. Like one of the feelings that I was having before coming up here was, what if I don't say the right thing? Or, like, am I allowed to be 100% genuine with, like my opinions on these topics? Or do I have to kind of be careful and be careful with the words that I choose, or maybe not, like just being afraid of, am I allowed to be 100% honest today? Is this a safe space for me to be genuine and talk about my experiences? I think sometimes it can be intimidating for sure. Representation is so important also because, if somebody that looks like you is up on, in these spaces or taking up space, you feel much more understood, right? And because you think, well, this person kind of, they look like me or they've had a similar experience, you feel like you can trust them. And it's definitely much more comforting and I think that helps.
I think that it's two major parts to this question. And the second that I read, that it was going to be a conversation about whiteness, I leaped and I was like, yes, I like talking about stuff like this. Only because, again, it goes back into the idea of the white fragility or being challenged oftentimes as human beings. It's not just a white thing, by the way. It's just as human beings in general, we are attracted to or we move towards things that make us feel comfortable, make us feel at home, and that is like us, right? So if we see someone like ourselves, or if we see someone who shares maybe a similar upbringing, right? If I see somebody walking around, and I might get some boost for this, but if I see somebody walking around with a Montreal Canadiens hat, I'm gonna be like, hey, friends, right? Because we share that love for the same sports team, right? We wanna go towards things or people who are like us. And I think that sometimes those biases that are implicit, right? Like when it comes down to the hiring process, we begin to look at people who are like us, who maybe speak the same way as us. And that's a huge part of this as well, right? A huge thing that my parents struggled with is my mom has a college education, right? A university college education that she had in the Netherlands, but because she had an accent, people didn't take her as seriously, and they thought that she was less educated than another person who didn't have her qualifications. And stuff like that, right, begins to kind of play into our society. So that's one part. The second part, my mom and my dad, after migrating to the Netherlands and then coming to Canada as well, my parents left Ethiopia when a communist government took over, the Derg government, and they had to flee for their lives. And because of that, that's their relationship with politics, right? They don't trust politicians. They don't trust politics. You're seeing people migrate to Canada for various reasons, and some of them don't have the relationship that we have. The idea of my rights, my freedoms, the things that I have, I'm allowed to say this because government is supposed to be serving and protecting me, right? So with my parents, whenever I go to conferences like this, they get a little scared, and I look at my mom and I go, they can't deport me for saying what I want to say. But in my mom's mind, she says, well, the government can switch at any time, and then we might have to be refugees again. So the whiteness conversation comes to one, who are you hiring, and are you looking outside of yourselves? But also the second part of it is, are we capacity building? Are we encouraging, and are we helping people that come to this country or even live in this country that don't have trust within these powerful positions? And are we telling them, it's okay, nothing's gonna happen to you, those traumas are not gonna take place here, and doing the extra step, because some of these communities need the extra step to even get involved within stuff like this. You can't just say, oh, only white people applied, so I'm just gonna hire white people. You have to ask the question, well, why aren't people of color applying?
That's good. Anybody else? Good? Good? Yeah? Okay. We're ready to move on? Okay. The next question, how does Canada's colonial past and present affect Canadian identity, and how can immigrants be included in the decolonization process?
I'll tackle that one. me just adjust this. Okay, so I guess first, how does Canada's colonial past and present affect Canadian identity? I think enormously. I think when, the first burial site for the children in the residential school was found, oh gosh, it had such a profound impact on people, and that I didn't know was possible. I had people reaching out to me asking me if I was okay, how I was taking the news, and I was like, what do you mean? Like, I've known this my entire life. Like, I grew up with this history. So, very, very thankful to those who reached out to me because I know they were very genuine, but the way I did see it impact some people and how they started to question their own identity and what they were proud of, it was kind of nice to feel like maybe others were finally kind of understanding where we're coming from, because we're not all like just against Canada, right? We want to be a part of something, and it's kind of crazy how, as people who are Indigenous to this land, we are still looking in. We're outside still looking in, and it's hard to know where to go and how to feel, and I think Canadian identity has changed a lot because of this truth that has come to light. But for others, it's kind of just another day that we're still walking in that knowledge. So I think that it has changed it, hopefully for the better, because I think truth and knowledge is everything. It's powerful and it's freeing, and everyone deserves to know the truth so they can make their own honest evaluation and determine, what does my identity mean to me? What am I going to do to implement, positive change in the system, and how am I going to, potentially see my Indigenous coworkers and peers and friends, and how can I support them? And I guess for the other part of the question, I think it provides a really amazing opportunity for immigrants to kind of connect with Indigenous folk, because we're in that same way, we're kind of on the outside looking into the society that we would like to belong to, but we'd also like for it to become more part of us, more in recognition of who we are and celebrating who we are. Because as Canada, you think of it as just a very diverse place, full of opportunity and kind people, and you want it to embrace you as much as you would like to embrace it. And that feeling has to be reciprocal. And for Indigenous people, I think we've obviously already stuck our hand out to help initial settlers find their way on this land. And I think it would be an inappropriate task for us to put our hand out again, right? And just maybe have it put your hand out to us and help us heal, and let us bring you into the beauty of our culture, and just show you how we were once completely embraced in this balanced life. Because I think we have so many beautiful elements of our culture to share with people that aren't even necessarily on like a spiritual, religious aspect, but just here's the land, here's how you practice gratitude every day, and here's how it'll impact everyone around you. So I think immigrants and having more Indigenous representation in the field of immigration and refugees would be a beautiful partnership, and I think it would probably help others feel more connected to some of the original people of the land.
Also, education is super important. I know we've mentioned this a lot of times throughout the panel today, but I'm thinking back on when I first came to Canada, in school I didn't really learn about Indigenous history or the Indigenous people that were here. It wasn't until I was in high school and I took an elective that was about Indigenous history that I finally got to learn a lot more about that. And I think it's super important because when you come here as an immigrant, you learn a lot about Canadian history, but you're learning about white Canadian history. I want to know about the real Canadian history, and that is Indigenous history, And I think that that's something that we definitely need to push more for because it's so important. As an immigrant, I didn't know anything about Indigenous people here, and it's really upsetting that I didn't get to learn much about it until later on in my life. And it should have been one of the first things that I learned. So that's.
I just want to speak to my experiences growing up. And yes, we had talked about education and understanding and just being able to learn about Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And I feel like one of the most profound things that I have gained living in the Yukon was that we never shied away from that growing up. And as a 6-year-old being in a new place, my educators were the elders. My educators were First Nations and Indigenous people themselves who were able to take me on the land and talk about the experiences. And this is not something that they had specifically for immigrants. It was something that was ingrained within the educational system because it's so key for anyone, because the last residential school system in the Yukon closed in 1996. And so it was I wasn't even born then. But that was something that they have always made sure to incorporate and include, and that was never, I don't even know. I thought for some reason that was happening all over Canada, and to know, having grown up, that that was not the case. I would talk about the Indigenous people and the history of residential school in the 60s, scooped some of my friends from the bigger areas, not calling any cities in particular, but where it was a little bit unknown, or like, yeah, I've heard about that term. I'm like, heard about that term? Like, there's so much more to that. Like, honestly, my background in social work is really, a lot of it is rooted in what I was able to learn in my experiences and learning about the history and the real history of Canada, and the not so great things, especially the not so great things, that has really drawn me to the area of social work. And so I'm really passionate about how we can better ensure that immigrants right off the bat, not even the pre-arrival stuff is so key, knowing exactly having some sort of understanding of what they're kind of stepping into, because there's so many people I've spoken to throughout my life that come into Canada with one perception of what it's going to be like over here, and then they're very shocked at what they learn, or shocked is one thing, or they could skate by their whole lives here and not even know anything about it. And so I think it's really important that there has to be changes made on a macro level to make sure that that is on the top priority.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so how I'm going to do this, I'm going to give each one of you 20 seconds. 20 seconds. So for something profound, something meaningful, something inspiring, something, Ira's navigating or negotiating for 25.
You'll start with Holly, right?
We started, you guys go.
No pressure.
I'm starting with you, Selma.
Okay. Does my 20 seconds start already?
You can do that. You can for 20 seconds, and that can be it.
I think really what I hope you can take away from what we've all spoken on is this isn't about you as an individual. We've spoken a lot about whiteness and about problems with representation, but I think you need to understand that this is a systemic, like we're working against a whole system. So please go back to your work and take a look at what you can do to dismantle the systems that are working against us, please.
Okay. For myself, I hope that, again, we heard earlier on that we all feel very, I can speak on my fellow panelists here, that we feel very honored to be on this panel speaking to you and having this time and really talking about some of these really difficult but very needed conversations. And I will just say that I hope that this is not the last. I hope that you will continue to make sure to include youth voices on the table and make sure that you are validating their experiences and presenting opportunities where they can speak on their lived experiences and changes they want to see.
Désolée. Ouais, ok. Moi, ce que j'aimerais que nous retenions, que vous reteniez, c'est, on en a déjà parlé, mais c'est de toujours, de façon constante, faire appel à l'introspection. Je sais que j'ai déjà mentionné ça, mais c'est très, très important. Même si on croit qu'on n'a pas de préjugés, voilà, on a fait ce qu'il fallait. C'est un peu comme on dit en bon franglais, là, comme un petit check-up à chaque fois. Faire appel à l'introspection, s'asseoir avec soi-même et se poser les mêmes questions qu'on a abordées ici, se poser ces questions-là à soi-même et être vrai avec soi-même. C'est très, très important. Voilà, c'est ce que j'aimerais qu'on retienne.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I'm sure a lot of you might have resonated with what we said, but then maybe someone else in the audience might have been like, I disagree, I don't get it. Either way, I'm very glad that you were able to sit in this space and to listen, because that's a huge step. And I also want to recognize that as you go back to invoke change and to create change, I hope you all recognize that everyone comes to change from a different position, so your resistance might look different from someone else's, but it's all equally very important. Thank you.
First and foremost, thank you. Secondly, this is something that I want to just touch on and say, and I want to say this every single time, but you know, colonialism hurts every single one of us, and we are all impacted. We are all victims of our own past, and that Indigenous history was interrupted by colonialism. It is not Indigenous history. Colonialism is not. Just like slavery is not Black history, but it interrupted Black history. So I think it's very important that we begin to recognize and see these people and these individuals as people who can help and benefit us and can teach us, right? Education is everything. Proximity is everything. So if you can be close to people who are of different cultures, different backgrounds, do so, because it's important. Your own ignorance being removed is at stake. Thank you.
I would also like to thank all of you for giving your time today and listening to us. What I hope that you take away from today is that youth, we're really just wanting the best for not only for ourselves but for you as well. And when we talk about these things, we're not trying to go against you. We're not trying to attack anybody. We just want to see improvement for all of Canada. And yeah.
I feel like I can confidently say that we're all pessimistic optimists, myself included, very pessimistic, very realistic, but I think if there's anything that we stand to show is our resilience just in being here, like us as a panel, everyone here today, and that as honestly, as long as, you know, we are living and breathing, there is hope. There is hope for a better future, but we do need to get to work. Thank you.
Well, somebody put in Slido, somebody's got a job for you in Slido, because I don't know if you all saw, but the last question or comment that was put in Slido was, this panel of youth should be in the parliament. So we got a job for you. Okay. So you have all listened so wonderfully and clapped so politely. But I'm going to ask you to not clap impolitely and really give it up for these guys. Stand up, make a noise, and let them know how much you've appreciated this. You ladies left it all on the table, and that was very brave of each and every one of you to come here and speak from the heart the way you did, and we are so lucky as a group to have been witness to that, so thank you.